Hey folks, another morning swim practice, another chapter of the Red Badge of Courage. Last time we got Henry right up to the point of combat. He had been marching all day over ground that he had covered multiple times. They finally heard gunfire and were marched toward it. He saw his first dead body. He ended up in a line underneath some trees in a grove where the enemy fire was sort of knocking branches and little pieces of tree out, and it was falling on them. They were in this position when Union regiment in full retreat came running through their regiment and disappearing down the back. Henry started to wonder whether, in fact, the enemy was coming when they didn't immediately follow. And now we're going to get our first real glimpse of combat. He has been wondering whether he's courageous at all. The story is called The Red Badge of Courage. Courage is our main theme. And he has yet to be tested. Well, this is the chapter in which he is officially first tested. So you can tell that from the first lines here that we get. So we're gonna pick up where we left off, and we're gonna go from there. Then someone cried, "Here they come!" There was a movement and murmuring among the men. They displayed a feverish desire to have every possible bullet ready. Boxes were pulled around into different positions and arranged with great care. It was as if 700 new hats were being tried on. The tall soldier, that's Jim Conklin if you remember, having prepared his rifle, produced a red handkerchief of some kind. He was putting it about his throat with careful attention when the shout was repeated up and down the line. "Here they come! Here they come!" Guns were made ready. Across the smoky fields came a brown mass of running men who were giving loud screams. That'd be the rebel yell you guys remember from earlier in the Civil War lectures. They came straight on, bent near the ground and swinging their rifles in all positions. A flag rushed along near the front. As he caught sight of them, the youth was momentarily frightened by a thought that perhaps his gun was not loaded. That's an irrational sort of fear thought, I think. He stood, trying to remember the moment when he had loaded, but could not. A hatless general pulled his horse to a stop near the colonel of the 304th. Hey, we get a regiment number for the first time if you want to look up and see who the 304th is. He waved his hand in the colonel's face. "You have to hold them back." The colonel answered nervously. All right, General. All right, by God, we'll do our best, General." The general rode away. The colonel, perhaps to relieve his feelings, began to shout angrily at the men. The youth, turning quickly to make sure that it was safe behind, saw the colonel looking at his men with a bitter expression. He seemed to be sorry that he was associated with them. The man at the youth's elbow was murmuring to himself, "Oh, we're in trouble now, we're in trouble now." The captain of the regiment had been pacing excitedly back and forth in the rear. His talk was endlessly repeated. "Save your fire, boys. Don't shoot till I tell you. Save your fire. Wait till they get close. Don't be crazy fools." The youth, frequently with a nervous movement, wiped his eyes with his arm. His mouth was still open a little. He got the one glance at the enemy-filled field in front of him, and instantly stopped wondering if he had loaded his gun. Before he was ready to begin, before he even announced to himself that he was able to fight, he threw the rifle into position and fired a first wild shot. Suddenly he was working his gun like an old soldier. He suddenly lost concern for himself and forgot to look at a threatening fate. He became not a man, but a member. He felt that something of which he was a part, a regiment, an army, a cause, or a country, was in danger. He was melted into a united personality, which was moved by a single desire. For some moments he could not run away, no more than a little finger can revolt from a hand. All right, so this is his first taste of combat, and the first time that he has to display courage or not. Let's take a second and analyze this. So he got one glance at the enemy-filled field in front of him and instantly stopped wondering if he had loaded his gun. He also stopped wondering if he was going to run or stay. He stopped wondering, I guess maybe would be the main point of that sentence. Then, before he was ready to begin, before he had announced to himself that he was about to fight, he threw the rifle into position and fired a first wild shot. So it was something that he did almost without thought. It's like somehow he became severed from the thinking sort of portion of his brain. And now he's working like an old soldier. He lost concern for himself. We got a lot of suddenlies here. Like there's a snap change, sort of like, snapping his fingers and something has changed inside of him. He stopped being concerned with himself. He forgot to look at threatening fate. He forgot about what was going to happen to him. He became not a man, but a member. I think that's an important line. He no longer feels like an individual. He's part of a mass, a group, this regiment, this army, this cause, this country. So he's a member of something bigger than himself. It says in the next line, he was melted into a united personality. It goes with the United States, I think, a little bit, which was moved by a single desire. So he could not run away. No more than a little finger could revolt from a hand. I think that's interesting that, we've talked about the army as sort of a creature or a being. In this case, it's almost like a human. It's personified, and he's just a finger of the hand of the army. A finger is what you use to pull the trigger. Anyway, if he had thought the regiment was about to be destroyed, perhaps he could have cut himself away from it, but its noise gave him assurance. It roared and shot with vast power. There was an awareness, always, of the presence of his companions about him. He felt the battle fellowship, more powerful even than the cause for which they were fighting. It was a strange fellowship, born of the smoke and danger of death. Soon he began to feel the effects of the war, a burning up feeling. Even his eyeballs felt like hot stones, and a burning roar filled his ears. Following this came a red anger, like a worried animal. So more sort of animalistic imagery. A well-meaning cow troubled by dogs. He had a mad feeling against his rifle, which could only be used against one at a time. He wished to rush forward and kill with his fingers. He wanted a power that would enable him to make a world-sweeping motion and brush everything back. His lack of power became clear to him and made his anger like that of a fenced beast. So we've got animals, we've got beast images here, and we've got anger as a primary emotion. Anger as opposed to fear, almost as if you can't feel both at the same time. It's always one or the other. Buried in the smoke of many rifles, his anger was directed not so much against the men who were rushing toward him, but against the waves of battle smoke that were pouring down his dry throat. He fought fiercely for relief for his senses, for air. So this is interesting. He gets angry, but he's not angry at the Southern soldiers. He's angry at the fact that he's hot, that he hasn't had a chance to drink, and he's tired, and he keeps breathing gun smoke. He just wants it to go away. So it's almost like an animal desire to breathe that is motivating him at this point. Buried in the smoke of many rifles... Oh, I just read that. There was a fire of anger mixed with a certain expression of purpose on all faces. The tall soldier was cursing in a loud voice. Suddenly another shouted, "Well, why don't they help us? Why don't they send us supports? Do they think?" The youth in his battle sleep heard this as one who is half awake. There was an absence of apparent heroes. The men, bending and rising in their hurry and anger, were in every impossible position. The steel rang out as the men ceaselessly employed the hot rifles. The rifles, when loaded, were pulled to the shoulders and fired without apparent aim into the smoke. This is another interesting line. There's an absence of heroes. The youth had always thought of battle as something heroic, but in reality it's something animalistic and something sort of mechanized and methodic. They're loading and firing, loading and firing, loading and firing, not even looking where they're firing. They're just firing. The officers neglected to stand in brave positions. They were leaping back and forth, roaring directions and encouragements. Often, they nearly stood upon their heads in their eagerness to observe the enemy on the other side of the smoke clouds. The lieutenant of the youth's regiment had found a soldier who had run screaming at the first of the shooting. Behind the lines, these two were acting a little private scene. The man was crying and staring with sheepish eyes at the lieutenant, who had seized him by the shirt and was hitting him. The lieutenant pushed him back among the rest with many blows. The soldier went dully, with his animal-like eyes upon the officer. Perhaps there was, to him, a strength expressed in the voice of the other, hard, with no sign of fear in it. He tried to reload his gun, but his shaking hands prevented him. The lieutenant had to assist him. The men dropped here and there. The captain of the regiment had been killed in an early part of the action. His body lay stretched out in the position of a tired man resting. But upon his face there was a surprised and sorrowful look, as if a friend had done something unkind to him. Maybe that's a metaphor for the whole Civil War itself. The crying man was hit by a shot that made the blood stream widely down his face. He then put both hands to his head. "Oh," he said, and ran. Another scream suddenly, as if he had been struck by a club in the stomach. Farther up the line, a man standing behind a tree had his knee broken by a bullet. Immediately he dropped his rifle and grasped the tree with both hands, and there he remained, hanging despairingly and crying for help, so that he might let go of the tree. At last a joyful shout went along the trembling line. The firing fell from a roar to a single shot. As the smoke slowly cleared away, the youth saw that the enemy had been stopped. They were scattered into small groups. He saw a man climb to the top of the fence and fire a last shot. Some in the regiment began to shout madly. Many were silent. Apparently, they were trying to think themselves. So they're trying to regain thought after this combat. And then the youth thought that at last he was going to faint. He became aware of the bad air in which he had been struggling. He was dirty and wet from the labor and heat. He grasped his canteen and took a long drink of the warmed water. A sentence was spoken up and down the line. "Well, we've held him back. We've held him back, so we have." The men said it joyfully, looking at each other with dirty smiles. The youth turned to look behind him and off to the right and off to the left. He experienced the joy of a man who at last finds time in which to look about. Underfoot, there were a few awful forms motionless. Arms were bent and heads were turned in unbelievable ways. It seemed that the dead men must have fallen from some great height to get into such positions. They looked as if they had been thrown out upon the ground from the sky. That's an interesting sort of set of imagery there as well, about how unnatural death looks. A small line of wounded men was going slowly toward the rear. It was like a flow of blood from the torn body of the brigade. Again, more personification of the... It used to be a regiment, now it's a brigade because they lost some soldiers. I guess it would be a battalion, I lied. To the right and to the left, the dark lines of other troops far in front, he thought. He could see lighter masses extending in points from the forest. They suggested unnumbered thousands. From a hill came a sound of cheering. Smoke rose slowly through the trees. The guns were sounding with a thundering effort. Here and there were flags, the red putting bits of warm color upon the dark lines of troops. The youth felt the old excitement at the sight of the flags. They were like beautiful birds, strangely untouched by a storm. He listened to the noise from the hillside, to a deep, steady thunder that came from afar to the left, and to the lesser shots which came from many directions. And he realized they were fighting too, over there, and over there, and over there. Before he had supposed that all the battles were directly under his nose. So this is again, him making some realizations about how small he is. Remember what his mom said when he left, that you're just one guy, Henry. You can't fight the whole rebel army yourself. A little guy in a big army. We're getting that sense, I think, here. As he gazed around him, the youth felt a flash of surprise at the blue, pure sky and the sun shining on the trees and fields. It was wonderful that nature had gone quietly ahead with her golden process in the middle of so much devilment. And then we get a contrast here that I think is important thematically. Nature doesn't care about war. The sun still shines, the wind still blows, grasshoppers still drone on in the fields. Nature is still nature, and it cares very little for humanity. But at least in this case, it's a benevolent, peaceful sort of nature. And I think it's meant to contrast, the word is devilment, with the terrible things that we do. The beauty of nature and how peaceful it is compared to what human beings are doing to each other. And that's where we decide to end the chapter. And that'll bring us to chapter 6. So it seems like he passed his test, right? He didn't run away. He fought, and I don't know whether you want to call it fought bravely, but he became part of the unit. He lost his sense of introspection, his ability to think about himself and his problems, and thereby was able to weather the storm of his first combat without running away. And he stopped thinking about it. Honestly, you don't hear him thinking about being afraid anymore. And so it seems like things have gone pretty well for him so far, and for the army. They didn't break, they didn't lose. So we'll move on to chapter 6 and take a look at that next.